special guest this morning. Pastor Gino is on a well overdue vacation this week with his wife. So we have Bill Honsberger here with us this morning. He's going to be speaking, and want to let you know he does have a table out in the foyer so you can pick up information about his ministry. So if you would, please welcome him up here.
Good morning. Let's pray. Father, thanks again for love and mercy and grace and all the good things you give us. Lord, every person here has come from different places, from thinking about work, from things that are going on at home or at school or in their family, just lots of different things. Father, grab us from wherever we've been and focus us in this morning on your word. I pray that your Spirit would grab us and teach us all, and we'd be different people because we spent time with you. Pray that your Spirit grabs our hearts and our minds, Father. Frees us from our self-delusions, frees us from our selfishness, and helps us to focus on you, Father. Thanks again for all that you give us. In Jesus' name, amen. For those of you that aren't familiar with what we do, I'm the director of Haven Ministries, which is a mission organization. We focus most of our time on people in non-Christian religions. We talk to everything from Muslims to Buddhists to the Scientologists, Baha'i, Mormons, JWs, pretty much everybody you can think of out there. And I have to say this, one thing that's common about all of them, other than their hatred for biblical Christianity, is their incorporation of Jesus. There's a zillion different Jesuses out there. There's the Jesus of the Jehovah's Witnesses, where Jesus was the Archangel Michael. There's the Mormon Jesus, a very perverted story indeed. There is the Muslim version of Jesus. There's a Buddhist. There's a Hindu version. Virtually everybody has to do something with Jesus. And what I want to introduce you to this morning is one of the old versions of Jesus, one of the old enemies of the church that has unfortunately made a tremendous comeback, as it were, in a book that came out 3 or 4 years ago called The Da Vinci Code. And I want you to turn to Colossians 1, and we're going to address the kinds of issues that have come back in the Da Vinci Code. When Dan Brown published that book, he was ingenious in some certain ways. He claimed that it was a novel. That got him off the hook if he made historical mistakes. And since he makes about 99% of everything he says is false, he can always fall back and say it's a novel. However, as soon as you open the book, there's a page that says everything in here is based on fact. And all of the stuff that comes through the book about Jesus is taught by two scholars who are here to tell us the new story, the real story, the hidden story about Jesus that has been kept alive for 2,000 years by this secret little group. And if you had the decoder ring and knew all the sacred words and the secret handshakes and stuff, you too could have the inside story of Jesus. And in this book, he promotes a bunch of things that are very familiar with people that know about Gnosticism. Gnosticism is an old enemy of the church. There are still Gnostic churches. In fact, there's a few of them here in town. And for the most part, we're not really familiar with the ideas, but maybe when I explain it, you'll start to recognize this. You'll have heard it. You'll have seen it around town, as it were. Certainly, Dan Brown does not come out and say, I hate Jesus. In fact, if he had done that, probably the book wouldn't have sold. It's sold over 25 million copies to date, and publishers say that means roughly 100 million people have read the book. And what's even worse is that this summer, Tom Hanks and Ron Howard are putting together the Da Vinci Code movie, which I guarantee will be probably a monstrous hit. And the good news about all this is that you're going to have wonderful opportunities to share about Jesus, because everybody's going to be talking about Jesus. It won't be the biblical Jesus, but everybody will be talking about Jesus. Again, if Dan had come out and said, I hate this Jesus, it just wouldn't have sold. Even in our fairly pagan culture, that would have been a little bit too strong. So what he does instead is basically make the idea that there's a different Jesus than the New Testament presents. There's a different Jesus than most people have heard of. And this Jesus got married, and he had children, and they became Charlemagne and Charles Martel and all these, the Merovingian kings and stuff like this, and that his descendants are alive. And, oh, by the way, Jesus was into sacred sex, and they had orgies and all sorts of bizarre stuff like this. And in this, he's promoting some very, very old ideas. Well, Paul is addressing these ideas in Colossians. The Apostle John addresses them in 1 John. These ideas have been around since very early on, mainly because they were part of Greek culture in some respects before Jesus is even known. After the coming of Jesus Christ, just like a lot of religions morphed today and put Jesus in the mix, that's what the Gnostics did. They took these old ideas and they put Jesus in the mix. If you talk to them, every Gnostic back then and today would say, oh, we love Jesus. Oh, Jesus is incredibly high. He's one of the highest spirits out there. He's so wise and so wonderful. And he's so wise and so wonderful, he would never be so foolish as to come here in a body. That would be a terrible mistake. That's the stupid thing that all of us have done. And so Jesus would never be like that. So they're not really denying Jesus on the face of it. They're just going to give a very different picture. Now, in Colossians 1, verse 13 and following, we're going to read this, and then we're going to come back and walk through it and see what Paul is emphasizing here. Excuse me. For he delivered us from the domain of darkness, and he transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. And he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also head of the body of the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself might come to have first place in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. And although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he has now reconciled you in his fleshly body through death, in order to present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach. If indeed you continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, in which I, Paul, was made a minister. Now, in the end of this passage, Paul is expressing a fear he has, a concern he has about the Colossian church. They're in the midst of a culture, and like the American church is in the midst of its culture, it is very easy for the church to become the same thing as the culture and lose its prophetic voice. And in the sense of the Greek culture, there were certain ideas that had flowed through Greek culture for hundreds of years. And it's these ideas that have incorporated themselves in Gnostic teachings. And this is what Paul's addressing. And Paul is concerned about it. He's afraid that these people are going to leave what they've been taught, and they're going to turn instead to these other ideas. And so Paul is making a few major points about this. And again, to help you understand Gnosticism, I don't want to give you a full-blown, boring lesson about what it's really teaching, but there are a few central ideas, and some of them I already hinted at. Jesus was revered as one of the highest gods. Now, like all pantheons or pagan systems of gods, there's lots of gods. There's gazillions of gods in pagan religions. And you can see this all over the world, whether it's the Greek or the Babylonian or Egyptian, or if you look to India today, there's 330 million plus gods in India. They just keep adding new ones as they discover new things. That's very much a pagan mindset. And the thing about all these gods is that they have a role to play. All of them have jobs, which we'll go into later. What's happening here with Paul as he's addressing this issue is that the Gnostics have somehow put Jesus into their pantheon like they put everything else. So they could very honestly look in the face, oh yes, I believe in Jesus. I love this Jesus. He's great. He's wonderful. As much as any Mormon or Jehovah's Witness, I've had Muslims tell me that they are better Christians than I am, because they would never say anything so evil about Jesus like you Christians say. Everybody wants to do something with Jesus. The problem is what they do. Again, Jesus is one of the high gods, and unlike most pantheons, which are spread this way with maybe one or two central gods like Zeus or Hera, the Gnostic had a hierarchy that went up and down. There are high gods, and then there are low gods. And the lowest god of all, the worst god of all, was called the demiurge. And this god was evil. Why? Because this God created the world. Get the hint? Jehovah, the Jewish God, is the worst god of all the gods that the Gnostics could think of, because this God made matter. And matter is evil. Matter is a prison to the Gnostic. You'll never hear this from any other religion on the planet, but if you look in 1 John 4, I'm not telling you to go there, but if you look there, there's this interesting thing John says. John says, anybody who denies that Jesus has come in the flesh is an antichrist. Well, there's only one group that I know of that's ever said anything like that, and that's these Gnostics. The early church had a nickname for them. They called them Docetists, which is from the Greek word dokeia, which means to appear. Jesus merely appeared to show up here in a body. He merely appeared to live a sinless life. He merely appeared especially to die on the cross, and he merely appeared to resurrect physically from the dead. None of that really happened, because, again, Jesus would not be trapped in a body. And so what the apostles and the other witnesses apparently saw in their minds was an apparition, a ghost of some sort, but not a physical being. So already we've denied the incarnation. God is no longer with us other than faking us out. They denied the Trinity because Jesus is a high God and Jehovah is the worst of all gods. And right down the line, they deny the atonement, they deny the resurrection. So the Gnostic Church is a denial of everything the Bible says about Christianity. And of course, that doesn't bother them. They affirm all that. But that price tag is high, as we're going to see. So in this picture, I'll give you just a modern version of it. Some of you remember about 6 or 7 years ago, there was a group in San Diego called Heaven's Gate. And they committed mass suicide, about 40-plus people. And if you went on their website that day, and this is my job, I'd never heard of this bunch before, but I go on the website and there's a button on their desktop that says, "Our position against suicide." Irony of ironies. So I turned to this, of course, and other than the little bit about the Hale-Bopp comment about there being a rocket ship hiding behind that, it was like walking back 2,000 years ago. It was pure Gnosticism. And basically the argument was, if we stay here in this life, we are committing suicide. Because we are divine beings that somehow have been trapped in matter. So when we get rid of this matter, when we free ourselves from our body, our divine spirits can flow through the universe and all this kind of wild stuff. That's pure old-fashioned Gnosticism. It hasn't gone away. It just keeps coming back in different forms. It's similar to a lot of the New Age things. Their favorite illustration for the Gnostics is that we're all divine sparks, or their word was aeons. And think of a sun. And the sun has different rays going out. Each one of those is us. And we're all these divine beings. We're all gods, right? Like the snake said. But what happens with Gnosticism is somewhere along the line we got trapped in this body. This evil God Jehovah fooled us all and trapped us and made us stuck here. So the goal is to get out of this body. This body is what's evil. Now the Hindu and Buddhists have a related version. To them, this world or this matter is an illusion. But it's also bad. Both of these are direct attacks on the Jewish account of who Jehovah is. Jehovah is the creator of the world. He made all things, both visible and invisible, and the Gnostics despise that. That's why the Jehovah is the worst of all gods. So that's just a real quick rundown of most of what the Gnostics say, the bigger ideas. Let's walk back to this passage again and see what Paul's really saying. For he delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Now let's just stop right here. How Jewish of Paul to say such a terrible thing. But it's nothing the Greek would hold on to. This idea that there is a holy God whose law we have rebelled against, it's an offense to the Greek. And in case you haven't noticed, it's an offense to the American as well. Or the European or anybody else. And maybe you have stories, I don't know, maybe you're different from mine. You have stories of how you share the gospel with your friends and your neighbors and your family, and you've told them that they're sinners. And of course they rejoiced at that thought, and they welcomed you, and they thanked you so much for sharing that with them, right? Of course they did. People always rejoice when you tell them that they're screw-ups, that there's something terribly wrong with them. It sells so well. That's why some of our biggest churches in the country, including the biggest new one, Joel Osteen's church, have made it a point to quit talking about sin. Joel Osteen's on record saying, we're never going to talk about sin here. Well, what a surprise that it becomes the biggest church in the country in a couple of years. People don't want to hear about this. This is bad news. This is something that's not going to sell well. And American pastors have learned, sadly too many of them. Tell people what they want to hear, and they'll rejoice, and they'll come alongside. Paul is not in the business of making the Colossians happy. Paul's in the business of making the Colossians holy. And he's telling them the truth. And the truth is that the thing that Jesus came for was the redemption of sin. There was something that was broken, and it's our relationship with God and with each other. Now, anybody who seemingly reads the internet or the news or watches anything or just lives, ought to be aware that there's something wrong with us, that there's something broken. But we're in the business of denying all that. We're just fine. I like to think of it in a simple way. Nobody gets to go to hell. Maybe Adolf Hitler, but since he was baptized by the Mormon Church 12 years ago, maybe even Hitler voted. Everybody's okay. Everybody's fine. So when Paul introduces this concept that there is this redemption of sin that the Colossians need to pay attention to, this offends their sensibilities. And let's face it, like I said, it doesn't really make us happy either. But it's critical to what he's going to say next. This whole rest of this discussion starts right here. The Greeks did not have this notion in their religion. It's one of the reasons why they hated the Jews. The Jews were running around telling everybody God's holy. Look at the Greek gods. Nothing holy there. If you look at all the ancient pantheons, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Greeks, and the rest of the gods, these are just, Beverly Hills 90210 on steroids. They're all having sex with each other. They're all attacking each other. They all, go to war with each other, cheat on each other. It looks just like us, only bigger, slightly faster and stronger. That's all that's going on in the ancient religions. The difference was this one Jewish God comes up out of the desert and says, no, there is right and there is wrong. There are things you cannot do. There are things that are going to separate you from God. And you need to be redeemed, and you need to be forgiven, and you need to acknowledge all of that. And the Greeks said, oh, this is stupid. We have no use for that. It doesn't fit the knowledge we have of ourselves. We like to see ourselves as divine beings, as the most wonderful people ever imaginable. That's us as Greeks. That is the culture Paul is talking to. Look what he says next. And he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Wham! If he hadn't slammed him, he's going to get him real hard right here. It's a real simple word, this word image. It means icon. If there was any word that made sense to a Greek, it's icon. It's like going through Ephesus or Athens or all these different places. There are idols or icons literally everywhere. That culture was saturated. Like Vegas has gambling machines, the Greek culture has icons. But there's something different about what he's saying, because he's not talking about a piece of wood or a piece of silver or some piece of cement or something like this. He is talking about in Jesus' physical body. He is the image, the icon of the invisible God. It's right there in the flesh. Now, from what I've already told you about the Gnostic sensibility, this is an offense. No, this can't be. But it's exactly what Paul is affirming. And to deny this is to be outside of the Christian faith. As he's going to make it very plain, it kind of undermines everything that happens. The second thing he says in this paragraph is that he's the firstborn, the archon, the ruler of all creation. Remember who the bad God is, Jehovah. Now look at what he's saying about Jesus. This Jesus the Gnostics claim to believe in, that they want to hold so high. This Jesus is partnering up with this bad one, this Jewish one that you hate. This is not about cultural anthropology 101 or cultural relativism where we slide Jesus around and make him appeal to everybody. This is about the very Jewish Jesus who was the physical image of the Jewish God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that the prophets told us about. And Paul is telling this to a Greek culture. You can't make Jesus into your own thing, which our culture loves to do today as well. He is the image of God, and he is the ruler of all creation. The very thing that you're despising, Jesus is the ruler of. Jesus is the creator of all this stuff. Look how he exemplifies this or expands this. For by him all things were created. Again, think of how the Gnostic is hearing this. Both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authority, all things have been created by him and for him. The Greeks would have had no problem with Jesus creating sandcastles out in the sky. There are lots of religions that are really big on what's called metaphysics. All right, thousands of alternate universes and stuff like this. The more you read into stuff like that, I don't recommend this, Scientology or your Urantia, the more you see space cadet religion. You really see this all over the place. Urantia has so many alternate universes. There's 700,000 different Jesuses flowing throughout the universe. And the Gnostics would have no problem with any of that. As long as it's immaterial, as long as it's not part of this physical world, which is a trap and a prison, you can say anything. Well, I would argue our culture is very similar to that today. You can be very religious in America. You really can. Take Tom Cruise or some of these people, for example. You can believe there's an evil galactic emperor Xenu off 74 trillion light years away who created us and bombed us with hydrogen bombs, this whole bizarre Scientology story. And nobody cares. It's okay to believe that. You can believe pink elephants on the dark side of the moon at all times. It's okay to believe that too. That's religion in America. But if you say homosexuality or abortion is wrong, now you're in trouble. Now you're a bad person. Now there's something that must be done. All roads lead to the top, except if you say something like that. See, now you're starting to meddle in the physical world. Now you're starting to say that things that happen up there are tied and connected directly to things that happen here. And the Gnostic was not affirming that. The Gnostic despised that idea. Just like New Agers do today. We don't want a connection. We're all divine beings. We're either hid by the illusion or we're hidden by this trap of our bodies. And somehow we must escape them. Somehow they're all bad. God created the world and said it was good. He created us and said physical bodies and said it was very good. And the Gnostic and the New Agers say, no, this is bad. This is a trap. Look at the next thing he says. All things have been created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, there's this notion that was really popular around the time of the founding of our country called deism. And deism was the belief that there is a God, but this God didn't really involve himself in the world, didn't really do miracles or things like that. And so the famous illustration is the watchmaker God. He just wound the universe up like a clock and then took off, out doing his own thing. And this is Jefferson or Thomas Paine or people like this who are basically saying, well, yeah, God made the world and there's morality and stuff, but, we need to get it together ourselves. We need to use our own human powers and strengths and abilities to live this life. That's classic deist thought. Jesus is not fitting into that scenario other than some sort of moral example. But for what Paul is saying to the Gnostics who have, again, Jesus up there is fine, Jesus down here is a problem. Paul is saying that this very Jesus not only made the world, but he sustains it. He upholds it at all times. He is intimately involved in the details of this life. Now, this is something I'm not sure many of us really accept ourselves. It's hard for us to accept it. But it's the very thing Jesus is constantly saying in the Sermon on the Mount. Look what he says. God is concerned even about the hair on your heads. I'm making it easy. But some of you others are still struggling and making it hard for the Lord. Think that through. God is concerned about the death of a sparrow. What is that really saying? What does Jesus sum that whole up? Jesus knows the Father knows what you need. He knows how to take care of you. This is a people that didn't believe it either, and they'd grown up with Jehovah. Now we take this over into the Greek world, and the idea that this God is intimately involved in a real way is an offense. Now, I rarely do funerals, and don't do weddings very often either. I work as a missionary, not as a pastor. This summer I had to do a funeral from one of my interns from many years ago. And he and his wife are missionaries now with Campus Crusade, and their baby died. They knew from 3 months in that this baby didn't have a chance. It had a very, very destructive birth defect, and this is the kind of thing that I'm sure there are people in this room understand that you've already been through. And one of the most fascinating things about this funeral is, and I had to learn this the hard way because it didn't come to me easy as a minister, is that something about a funeral that really forces you to focus and remember what it is you really believe. You have to think it through. It just forces you to. And when you're looking at a box about that big, it forces you to think it through in even greater ways in my mind. And one of the most fascinating things about that entire day was the faith that I saw exhibited by my intern and his wife. Just an amazing day. Because they were absolutely convinced, maybe more than anybody else in the room, that this was not an accident, that we're not on some dirt clod spinning around in space somewhere, that there is purpose and meaning and hope to everything that happens in this life. That is what Paul is describing here. That he is the sustainer, that he is in the midst of our lives, not only in the good times, but through hard times as well. And their faith grabbed my heart, grabbed my attention. Jesus is there when we suffer as well. It is hard for us to see that. And that's why moments like that really focus us in on it. He is also the head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself might come to have first place in everything. Well, he's tied to this group of Christians. That's not a controversial thought too much. But this next idea is, in fact, it may be the worst idea. He is the beginning, the firstborn, the archon, the ruler from the dead. Well, to the Greek sensibilities, if coming here once was a bad thing and a foolish thing and a trap, how stupid do you have to be to come back a second time for more? This is why the Hindus see the world as punishment. You come back over and over again, not to get your life together the next time around the wheel, but no, because you're going to suffer over and over and over again. The Greek sensibility was just as strong. The first time here is a trap. You would not want to come back physically a second time. So what happens in Athens when Paul preaches on this? They start mocking when he brings up the resurrection. You can see this over and over and over again. Whether you're reading Plato, some of the earlier Greeks, or whether you come down to these Gnostic writers, the body's a bad thing. To come back again, to be resurrected made no sense. Reincarnation, transmigration, no problem because nothing's real. but not resurrection. You cannot mix the two. And that's what's happening in our culture as well. All sorts of people mixing a touch of Jesus with a little slice of Hindu thought and some Native American religion. Mix it all together and call it my own. Paul says Jesus is the ruler of even the life after death. Everything is about what he's done. Now, if you forget everything else I said this morning, this next verse is the key idea in this whole passage. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. Now, it doesn't sound that controversial. But I want to introduce you to a word. It's only used twice, here in this chapter and in the next chapter, where Paul is basically reiterating the same thing we're talking about. And it's a word that the Gnostics were using for their gods. It's this entire column of gods, and it was called the pleroma. It's a special word. It was only used in that direct context. The pleroma, to the believer in this whole thing, like in most pagan sensibilities, made sense to them. They thought this made perfect sense. Each of these gods had a place or a role, had a job, as it were. And you can still see this alive in say, modern India today, and you can see it in some ways analogous to the way a lot of Catholics are raised. Think about it this way. In India, all the different gods have jobs. And if you see Hindu art of any sort, usually the gods have lots of different arms in all sorts of different directions. It looks really weird to us. But to the Hindu believer, this is something really important. And what they're looking for is the god that's the arms that have something in it. And whatever tool that god is holding tells the believer what role that god plays, what job he has, in other words. So one of the favorite gods in India is Ganesha. It's the elephant head god. It's pretty easy to see. It's a human being with an elephant head, and there's a weird story behind that. But Ganesha has an axe in his hand, and his job is to clear out obstacles. So if I'm a businessman today and I've got to go from New Delhi to Singapore to sign a new deal, and I'm a little concerned about it, even though Ganesha may not be our family god or our village god, I will go lay an offering at Ganesha's temple, hoping that Ganesha will clear away all obstacles with his axe. That's the pagan sensibility. That's what the pleroma is full of. Lots of different gods with different jobs. Well, many of you, including my wife, were raised Catholic. And you understand what the saints are here for. They have jobs, don't they? All right, I need you former Catholics to be going, they have jobs. Mark, my partner at Haven Ministry, and I went out several years ago and talked to a Catholic family whose daughter has joined this really nasty concerned Christian cult that left Denver several years ago. And we were over at their house, and they were telling us how they're trying to sell their house, and nothing was working. So they took a statue of St. Joseph, and they buried it upside down in the yard. I see some of you Catholics nodding already. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the same mindset, which says, I need a middleman to help me do the job. We have several children from the Philippines, as a lot of you know, and one of our oldest friends of my wife is a Filipino lady named Dolly. Like most Filipinos, she's Catholic, takes it very, very seriously. In fact, I would argue very superstitiously. And one time when Terry was trying to witness to Dolly, Dolly made the comment that she can't pray to Jesus. He's just too high. But she can pray to the saints because she's not afraid of them. And when I heard this, I was so sad for Dolly. Because somehow we're going to muddle ourselves in this mid-level bureaucracy that's an invention of the church and not go, as Hebrews tells us, right to the throne of God himself, because that's what Jesus opened up for us. It's one of the sadder things about the belief in the saints, is that you get lost again in this level. Well, Paul takes this whole mindset, this whole idea of what the pleroma is, and all the different functions that it has. It's very pragmatic, and he says it, and let me read it again for you, but putting the right word in. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the pleroma to dwell in him. What a radical idea. Paul is taking their most favorite idea, the thing that they find comfort in. Every need, if you need a male son, there's the pleroma. If you need money, there's the pleroma. Whatever you need, find it in the pleroma. And Paul's saying something drastically different. Whatever you need, whatever is going on, all you need is Jesus. Because everything that you could ever want or need is in Jesus himself. It is the Father's good pleasure for all of the pleroma to be in this man. Think of how radical that thought is. You don't need any of the mid-level bureaucrats. Again, I'm not convinced most Christians believe this today. No, I need Jesus in Prozac, and I need Jesus in whatever Harvard University teaches, and I need Jesus in the Jesus Seminar. I need Jesus in something. Paul says no. He's the original Jesus freak. Everything you could ever want, everything you could ever need is in the person of Jesus Christ. And this is where God put it. Now that is, again, a radical thought for Americans today. You mean to tell me that if gas goes too high, that we don't need something else? You mean if my stock markets crash, if my marriage blows up, if my kids rebel, that I shouldn't use the wisdom of Peter Drucker and the wisdom of this world? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm pretty extreme on this, sorry. My point is this. Paul's argument to a culture filled with a zillion options is all you need is Jesus. That's it. Because everything you will ever need is already there. Why go messing around with counterfeits? That's the world I play in, is the counterfeit world. I'm so thankful Richard was commenting this morning. He always plays Holy, Holy, Holy when I'm here. I don't know why, but I love it. And I told Richard some of the times I've come out of some of the New Age meetings or places I go to, and I'll play that song over and over and over again, or Rich Mullins' Awesome God, or some of these songs, because it's like I need a bath after talking to some of the people where God is so mundane, and God's the carpet, and God's the dirt, and all this whole New Age thing. And this is not the case at all. There's a zillion gods for everything in the Gnostic world. And the first commandment is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You don't need anything else. That's what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, and that's what Paul is saying right here. You don't need middlemen. You don't need the pastor way up high, okay, or any other person, because everything you could ever want or need is in Jesus himself. Now, why is that the case? It's the Father's good pleasure for the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross, whether him I say were the things on earth or things in heaven. The blood of his cross. He's going to say this again in verse 22, his fleshly body. Paul's reiterating this point because this is exactly what the Gnostics are denying. He didn't really have a body, he never really died, and he never really rose from the dead. Well, let's just work our way backwards through that thought. Then we are never really reconciled. And the New Ager says that's fine. The Gnostic says that's great. Because we don't need to be reconciled. We're fine just the way we are. There's a great scholar on pagan religion named Peter Jones that I've worked with every once in a while. And Peter has written a number of books on what pagan religion used to look like and what it really did. And he goes through the whole sacred sex thing, something that Dan Brown is all about. One of the key stories in the Da Vinci Code is this young girl who's the center of the story. She observes as a young girl, her grandfather in this ritualistic orgy, and she's always been deeply offended, wants nothing to do with him. And by the end of the story, she's come completely around on this, recognizes what a deeply spiritual act that this is, and how wonderful it is to have sacred sex with all these different people. That's one of the main points that Dan Brown pushes, not only in the book, but on his website. Sacred sex. And again, you see this all over pagan religions. Well, this idea that that's something wrong with that is this offense of the Christian. And we inherited because it was originally an offense of the Jew. There's this really fascinating book called Why the Jews by Dennis Prager, who's an Orthodox Jewish columnist, very conservative fellow, if you listen to him on the radio. And although there's a couple of holes in the book, a few things I think he should have added. One of the things he points out in trying to wrestle with why are the Jews hated all over the world, in some cases hated by cultures that never even saw a Jew, they still hate them. And one of the things that he mentions is the role the Jews had in the world. That is, they brought Torah into the world. God used them to bring the message. And what was this message? If you think about it, there's a part of Leviticus and repeated again in Deuteronomy that we really don't like to read. We kind of shuffle through as fast as we can. Can't be having sex with your animals and with your mother and with your grandmother, with your aunt, with your daughters, with your men, with your sons. We just go through that as fast as we can until we find something nice to read, right? That's how a lot of us are. That message was there for a reason. The reason that God speaks to Moses and puts that message out is because this is how the pagans lived. This is what they commonly did. And folks, this is what they're doing today. And people like Dan Brown are celebrating it. We went through a massive change in our country 32 years ago. And it was over the flimsiest thing. 32 years ago, the American Psychiatric Association decided overnight on a vote that homosexuality was not deviant, that it was not pathological, it was not wrong, whatever you want to say. It was okay. It was just one of many alternate lifestyles, and we should affirm it. Here we are 32 years later. And homosexuality now, in some parts of this country, is not only to be tolerated, but to be affirmed as the most special, the best way to engage in human sexuality. In certain parts of the cultures, it is revered. Well, that's fascinating. What reasons did the APA have for making this decision? None. Culture had changed. The world was a different place. They just got on board and made it simple. Well, there were 2 articles in the Journal of American Medicine, one of the most respected journals in the country, that came out before that vote arguing that homosexual behavior is not deviant. And the American Psychiatric Association finally came out and said, well, we agree. And so now our culture has changed on this. Well, in the last 4 years, there have been 2 articles in that same Journal of American Medicine, one by doctors at Johns Hopkins, the top medical institution in the country, that now argue that there's nothing wrong with pedophilia, that children aren't victims, that they enjoy this, that there's no problem with this, and we should decriminalize this, because there are no victims here. Spooky to think about as we watch this right in front of our eyes, that our culture's mentality, as we've gotten farther away from God, we don't become atheists, folks, we become pagans. As we've gotten farther away from God and more into a pagan sensibility, we start to understand why the Torah was such an offense. You watch Jay Leno at night, and when he makes jokes about Michael Jackson, what does he say? Ew! Well, ew doesn't really matter much. But how he relates it is that he's not talking about what he's done is wrong and evil. They talk about what he's done as ew, as if, well, I wouldn't choose that, and I'm glad, well, if he does, it's okay. That's our culture. We don't want to say anybody's wrong anymore. And that's no different than the ancient pagan mindset. So when the Torah is introduced to the world through these Jews, you can imagine the love that the pagan cultures felt. The Canaanites, the Philistines, they felt the love, I guarantee it. They were basking in the warmth of their acceptance for this new God, this unconditional love that this new God had. No. They were offended beyond all means, and they hated this Jewish God. And they hated the people that sent it. Welcome to Why the Jews? Well, in this context, it really starts to make sense for us here. Why do we need to be reconciled? The pagan's idea is that I don't need to be reconciled. I am a divine being. I just need to get out of this body thing. But again, that's not how real people live. Real people live in this world where people are killing and raping and stealing and doing all the wonderful things that we as wonderful human beings do to each other. That's why we need to be reconciled. And how did this had to happen? Well, Paul first emphasizes, says it had to happen on this bloody cross. Now, I think most of you probably saw the movie The Passion a couple years ago now. And, well, it was a moving piece of art. I don't know about you guys, and I didn't agree with everything he did, but that movie just nailed me to the wall. I remember watching it with some of my kids and coming out of there saying, this is my fault. And it's very hard. Most of the early movies about the life of Christ just don't talk about that. I mean, they whiz through it so fast and it just doesn't grab you. In the same way, reading it in black and white and the text doesn't really grab you. But when you're sitting there during the scourging, and almost every shot is either you're seeing it or you're hearing it, all of a sudden it starts to have an impact, hit after hit after hit. This is a terrible thing. This is an incredible offense. There was this review from this very virulent anti-Christian writer for the New York Times, Frank Rich, who had never seen the movie at the time he wrote the review. He was basing his review on other reviews. But he knew it was a terrible movie. Why? Because it was so bloody. Yes, it was. And yes, it had to be. I think I understand why Frank Rich is offended. Because I understand why New Agers are offended. Folks, other than the fact that Jesus is the only way, the second most hated idea amongst New Age types is the atonement. The idea that Jesus had to pay for our sin. And you know what? You can hear that from church leaders, from Anglicans, from Roman Catholics, from United Methodists, from PCUSA and ELCA Lutherans. You can hear them say as well that the church's teaching on the cross is, quote, child abuse, end quote. That it's a terrible thing because God loves us so much he wouldn't have to do anything like this. I have this one friend I've spoken to for many years named Denver. He's a reader of the Urantia book, which is another, like Scientology, another space cadet book. And this idea just offends the heck out of him. And he told me one day, he says, why couldn't God just forgive our sins without that? Why couldn't he just wipe it all away? I said, Denver, you've hit it right there. That is the difference between you and I. You think sin is spilled milk, something you just wipe up with a rag and go on. To me, sin is destruction. And it destroys everything it touches. And it's why we end up shooting and knifing and bombing and raping and stealing and lying and all the other things we do. And that does not get wiped away with a rag. And that's the whole point of why this is such an offense, especially to the Gnostic mind. This bloody cross is implying there's something wrong with me. Amen. It's not implying it. It's putting it right in your face. When the pop book came out about 20 years ago, I'm okay and you're okay, there were several Christian responses, but one of the simplest ones was this poster I saw. It says, if I'm okay and you're okay, and then it points to a bloody cross behind it. It says, then somebody explain this. Great argument. Doesn't have to be much more complicated than that. And it works backwards. It's true. If there is a reason for this bloody cross, then it comes back to me. And it does. And I do need this. And I am the reason why this happened. And so is every other person in this room. And just to broaden this out and make it as inclusive as possible, so is every other person that's ever lived on this planet. We are the reason for that cross. And that is an offense. And it certainly was to Paul's audience. So he reminds them, through him to reconcile all things to himself, through the blood of this cross, through him I say whether things on earth or things in heaven. And although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, nobody here like that, right? No, we are all like that. We were alienated from God. The New Ager, best example I can think of in this one is Marianne Williamson, who's Oprah's best buddy and the guru to the stars. And in her book or in a channel book that she uses, The Course in Miracles, where Jesus says, you're not alienated from God, you are God. Oh, yay. And there's no such thing as sin according to the Course in Miracles. Then somebody explain Auschwitz to me. And Bosnia, and the library in Columbine, and Campuchia, and a zillion other places. Somebody explain, give me a different name. Is it just not real? It's just an illusion? Or were they doing a good thing by freeing all those people from their earthly, prisons? Or do we not all recognize, simply put, that that's terribly wrong? And we do this constantly. I have this, the joy, shall we say, of taking doctoral studies at the University of Denver. And 2 of my classes had to be taken at Iliff Seminary, United Methodist School. I do not recommend this for the faint of heart. It's just, DU is very liberal. Iliff hates. Iliff is on a crusade against all things Christian. And anyways, in the one class, I had a man named William Dean who was considered the most conservative professor on campus. And he hated me with every ounce of his being. And even the other students, my Marxist and atheist and pagan friends, they were even impressed with how much he hated me and how unprofessional he was. Folks, you had to work to do that. You really do. For those who know me, trust me, I did not do anything to earn this. This was purely just the fact of what I represented, I believe. Anyways, we had a whole semester on Christian thinkers. And out of that, they had 2 conservative Christian thinkers. They had Augustine and they had Aquinas and virtually nobody else. And so we were talking about Augustine, one of the great early fathers of the church, and his view of human beings. And Augustine has a very biblically centered view of human beings. We are a mess. We are sinful. We're rebellious. He's reading Paul and Paul's reading Isaiah, and they're just quoting all the same things. There's something terribly wrong with us. So at the end of that section on Augustine, he went around the room and he asked them all, what do you guys think of what Augustine says about human beings? And of course, he's talking to all my friends, and they hate Augustine. Oh, he's terrible. That's wrong. Human beings are wonderful. And he saves me for last, and I'm fairly confident he thought I was going to just recite some, well-known Bible verse that he could attack or something like this. What do you think of Augustine's view on human beings, Bill? And I said, which part of the 20th century did everybody miss? And he looks up, and I said, we managed to kill over 100 million of each other in just the last 100 years. How do you get off saying that we're basically wonderful and good? And he goes, oh. Novel thought, apparently. I don't know. When it says we have to be reconciled, by golly, I think he means it. Because we are broken. And we shred each other. And that starts with the fact that we're not reconciled before God. And as we're not reconciled before God, it spreads like a poison through our entire system and affects our relationship with our families, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, everybody around us. And Paul says, that's what you were. That's what you did. Then he says this encouraging thing. Yet now he has reconciled you, and he emphasizes again, in his fleshly body. It was real. A very real Jesus died on a very real cross to take care of very real evil. None of this is metaphysical sandcastles or anything like that. It happened right here. It happened for us. Look at the next thing he says. In order to present you holy and blameless and beyond reproach. This should be the most exciting thing I say this morning. There was a reason for that bloody cross. There's a reason why that body had to be real. Because God was in the business of changing us. Now, one of the things that Peter Jones has pointed out that I was just really fascinated by, I've been talking to witches for a long time, and he brought a different angle to this that I hadn't thought through before. But he talks about how witches celebrate the seasons, and that it just keeps going on repetitively. In other words, there's no sense of an eschatology in the pagan mind, a time when the world, is ended and becomes better, in the sense of how, for example, how Christians think about this. We don't see the end times being we don't see the heavenly estate being the same thing we see here. We see it as something beyond all possibilities. There's no more sin there. There's no more tears there. All these wonderful ways of telling us that world will be different than this one is now. Well, the pagan sees everything in this world as normal and natural, including the way we act towards each other. What a depressing thought, that the highest spiritual goal I can have is to be me already. And I know many of you that know me are depressed just thinking that too. And the first thing out of your mind is, yes, Lord, change him now. Thank you. I appreciate all your prayers that way. I really do. The reality of this is, folks, is that this is our issue, is that we desperately need to be changed. I do not want to be the same person I was 32 years ago. It's interesting how my family reacted to my salvation. I think I've told part of my testimony here before, but I will never forget the first Christmas the first New Year's Eve actually after I got saved. I got saved as a senior in high school in Dallas, living with my dad. I went to Bible college from there up here to Colorado. And that Christmas, so I've been a Christian almost 11 months at this point, I went out to L.A. and spent the holidays with my mom. My mom, my stepdad, and my brothers were all serious drinkers and all serious stoners and all serious partiers, and they were I was just a shock to the whole thing. I had become the bad seed. I was the black sheep in the midst. And I never forget my mom walking out the door that first New Year's. And she's walking out the door, and they're going to get, high somewhere. And my mom's already half-tanked before she leaves the room. And as she's walking out the door, she goes, "Well, Bill, aren't you going to go anywhere?" "Oh, I forgot. Christians don't believe in having fun." Snicker, snicker as she walks out. Well, that's my first New Year's Eve as a Christian all by myself. That was kind of an interesting night. But what's so sad about it to me is how my mom thought about this, because it was exactly how everybody else I knew thought, other than my new Christian friends. This is normal to go out and get loaded. This is normal to go out and get high. And if there's a price tag, most of my family has been arrested several times. My stepsister's been in federal penitentiary. My first cousin's been in state penitentiary. I was arrested several times. My youngest brother's been arrested several times. That's all normal. It was as big a shock for my family when I became a Christian. Then 8 years later, I become a cop. That was even more weird for my family. We'd always been on the other side of the flashlight, and all of a sudden, where had this kid gone wrong? Why was I messing it up so badly? That's how my family thought. That was normal for them. And to break out of that scheme and go in a different direction just didn't make any sense. But honestly, how can any of us look in the mirror and not say, "I wish I was not so fill in the blank"? If you're honest with yourself and you look at the mess you make up in your relationships with others, and your relationship at work, and ultimately, of course, your relationship with God, isn't everybody that's serious about the relationship with Jesus Christ saying, "I want to be different than I used to be"? I don't want to be the same person who snaps at people. I don't want to be the same person who, runs and hides and screams and yells and does all the things that we do. I want to be a different person than I used to be. The pagan and the Gnostic says, "You're already a divine being just as you are. Celebrate yourself." No. I'd rather not, thank you. That person is someone who was heading to hell. And maybe prison is a halfway stop. The fact is, the most exciting thing about what he says is why Jesus had to die on that bloody cross. It is because he's in the business of wanting to change me and everyone here. This is the whole reason why he did it. And then he reminds them at the end, "If indeed you continue in the faith firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, in which I, Paul, was made a minister." One of the huge differences between Christianity and Gnosticism. Gnosticism was for the elites. Again, you had to have the secret decoder ring and everything to be on the inside, to know the true picture of the universe, who you really were. And everybody else, well, they're just the herd. Nobody really cares. By contrast, Jesus preached on the mountaintop and in the temple. And Paul says, I go everywhere in the public and teach this. This is for all people. This isn't just for the secret, special dumplings that God has. This is for everyone, inside of this building and outside of this building. And that's the exciting thing about it. And Paul's reminding them that if you leave this behind, if you leave behind this very real Jesus and move to this new understanding of Jesus, as it were, what you're missing? There's no reconciliation because nothing was ever changed. Nothing was ever changed because nothing was ever wrong in the first place. And whatever is, just is. Revel in it. Enjoy it. Watch people slaughtering each other, and it's just normal. No, it's not. And God has a greater plan than that. And Paul's invitation to the Colossians, and my invitation by extension to y'all, is to understand what great opportunities you will have this summer to share the gospel with people who need hope. That it is not just the way it's always been, that there can be a difference, that it can make an impact in our lives. And that's the reason why this very bloody cross had to happen, and why Jesus' very real broken body had to pay that price. Let's pray. Father, your mercy and grace overwhelm me. Forgive me, Father. Lord, I pray for each person here as they get a chance this summer to talk with their friends and neighbors and family, that you give them boldness and courage to share the hope of the gospel. That you're in the business of changing us all, Father, is such good news. Help us remind people of how that happened and what it means to them. Father, grab our hearts and souls of every person in here. If there's somebody here that doesn't know you, Father, let this day be the day they're changed. Touch their heart and their soul, Father. Free them from their self-reliance and all the things that bring them down. Father, help them to understand that all that Jesus has done for them. We pray this in his name. Amen.